the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. Now we're taking a look at pirate radio in the UK in the mid-1960s, a time when BBC and government wanted to completely ignore youth culture. Now in the first half of the 1960s, pop music was rarely heard on BBC, and that was the light programme as it was then. Shows like Saturday Club and Pick of the Pops were an oasis in a desert of Mantovani and Housewives' choice. Now Radio Luxembourg was the only station in Europe to transmit non-stop pop music. But famously the signal was very poor and the music just faded in and out. But it was the only pop music you could actually listen to. All this changed. The BBC's lack of interest in pop music resulted in a whole new generation of pirate radio, and they transmitted pop music non-stop from early morning till midnight-ish. On the 28th of March 1964, Radio Caroline was the first pirate radio station to take to the waves. That's the sea and airwaves. Pirate radio stations operated from ships. Also some from old World War II forts in the Thames estuary and elsewhere. The ships were outside British territorial waters, so not technically illegal, but the government soon made life very difficult for these maritime DJs. Now lots of pirate ships and forts sprang up around the UK. Some were very short-lived, hours, day or two at most. People like Radio Free Yorkshire off Bridlington and Radio Red Rose off Liverpool. Others were a lot more successful. NOP published a poll in 1966, an audience survey, that showed that Radio 390, Radio England, Radio Scotland and Britain Radio all had more than 2 million listeners. But it all came to an end on the 14th of August 1967 with the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act. That came into effect and it was all over, well, mostly, for the pirates. On the 30th of September 1967, BBC launched Radio 1 and the BBC finally became rock and roll. In this Rock and Roll Unraveled show, we're going to take a look at two of the more successful pirate stations, Radio Caroline and Radio London. And, as well, one of the strangest stories, that's Radio Such, which became Radio City, set up by the flamboyant rock and roll star Screaming Lord Such. It's a tale of failed mergers, boarding of their radio station fort in the Thames estuary, and murder. All that to come. Well, I remember a family holiday, a caravan in Poole, 1961. The transistor radio set to Radio Luxembourg 208 medium wave. Now, many of the shows on Luxembourg were sponsored by record companies, and they were there to promote their new singles, mostly. And the introductions from the DJs would often provide a little bit of extra information. And I can remember back in 1961 straining to hear this particular song as the signal faded in and out. And the DJ introducing the next platter. Our first 45 is on Columbia DB4715. And that's Helen Shapiro, Walking Back to Happiness. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now we're looking at UK pirate radio in the 1960s. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Just check out the competition link on my homepage, and that's rockandrollunraveled.com. There's a simple question, and you're in the draw for a signed copy. Rock and Roll Unraveled tells the story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector magazine's review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you very much, Record Collector. Well, good luck with the competition, and meanwhile, back at the plot. Well, radio started out in the UK back in 1922. And on the 14th of November that year, what became the BBC made its first daily broadcast, and that was a consortium of leading wireless manufacturers, including Marconi. And it came under government control in 1927, and that's when it was called the British Broadcasting Corporation. And Radio Luxembourg, well, that started in 1933, and as I mentioned before, it was the only station in Europe to play non-stop pop music. The one thing everybody remembers about Radio Luxembourg was the famous advertisement from Horace Batchelor. Now, he had this method of increasing your chances of winning on the football pools. Now, the football pools was the only way of winning large amounts of money with a small bet before the National Lottery came along. And you had to contact him with your forecast, and he always spelt out his address. So he would say, and that's Horace Batchelor at Keynsham, spelt Keynsham, Bristol. Now, after World War II, mid-1945, the BBC launched its 3 channels: the Light programme for general entertainment, the Third programme, classical music and serious drama, and the Home service for news and current affairs. BBC Radio still looked exactly like this when pirate radio arrived in 1964. And it was 1951 when Radio Luxembourg launched its famous 208 medium wave. And to put the music scene into perspective, in the early 50s, the first singles chart was published on the 14th of November 1952, courtesy of the New Musical Express, the NME, and that was based on sales from just a couple of dozen record shops in the London area. And the first chart was a top 12 singles, with the first UK number 1 from Al Martino, Here in My Heart. And Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and His Comets, well, that entered the UK charts on the 7th of January 1955, and that was the song that kick-started rock and roll around the world. The crucial British hit came from Lonnie Donegan with Rock Island Line, and that entered the UK charts on the 6th of January 1956, and that was very much the start of skiffle and British rock and roll. Now, BBC did introduce some pop music shows on the Light programme, and in 1955 Pick of the Pops appeared, and 57, well, what started out as Saturday Skiffle Club became the famous Saturday Club in 1958, and that was hosted by Brian Matthew, and that really was good. I remember listening to that. Saturday mornings were great. It was children's favourites 9 till 10 and Saturday Club 10 till noon. Now, not much else happened for a while. The golden age of rock and roll faded away. The early 60s, it was very much the beat groups in the UK that came to the fore. Radio Luxembourg, with its fading in and out signal, was still the main source of pop music for the UK's youth, and BBC Light programme didn't really get much further than Saturday Club and Pick of the Pops, a smattering of pop music programmes across the BBC. But came the revolution. On the 28th of March 1964, pirate radio arrived. That was the Fortunes with Caroline, the theme tune for Radio Caroline. Well, it made the first broadcast on the 28th of March 1964, and spoiler alert coming, on the 30th of September 1967, Radio 1 was launched. It took 3.5 years for the BBC and the government to recognise the need for pop music on radio. Well, back to Caroline. They made their first broadcast on their ship MV Caroline, and that was Easter Saturday at noon. The introductions and first show were handled by Simon D and Chris Moore, and the first song was the Rolling Stones' Not Fade Away. And maybe that was a tip of the cap to Radio Luxembourg and their famous signal that faded in and out. Hot on the heels of Radio Caroline was Radio Such, and that was formed by flamboyant British rock and roll star Screamin' Lord Such. Now, on the 24th of May, 64, he set sail on the Cornucopia. It was actually a publicity stunt, and he's not thought to have actually broadcast from the ship. But he did transfer to the World War II anti-aircraft fort in the Thames estuary, and that was called Shivering Sands, the fort. In 1960 he formed his group Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages, and at the end of 61 they released their first single, Till the Following Night. That was written by Sutch and produced by legendary independent producer Joe Meek. Now the Savages' lineups at various times included Nicky Hopkins, who was a regular contributor to Rolling Stones' live performances and albums, and Richie Blackmore, long-time member of Deep Purple. Nicky Hopkins parted company with the Savages in the April of 62, and Richie Blackmore played his last gig on the 12th of October 62. Now, at a Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages gig on the 25th of June 62, Keith Moon, who would become the Who's drummer, approached Carlo Little for some drum lessons. Now, Carlo Little's interesting because he also played for the Stones quite regularly before Charlie Watts became their drummer. And it was March 63 when he released his best-known track, Jack the Ripper, and that again was produced by Joe Meek. Well, the first actual broadcast of Radio Sutch was on the 27th of May, and the first DJs, as well as Sutch, included Reg Calvert, his manager, and Brian Paul, who was one of the Savages. Now, Reg Calvert was also a co-owner of Radio Sutch. And, of course, as you'd expect, the first record they played was Sutch's Jack the Ripper. Now, it was billed as Britain's first teenage radio station, and that could well have been chosen as a slogan because he was well into politics, was Lord Sutch, and he formed the National Teenage Party. They fought their first election in 1963 in a by-election at Stratford-upon-Avon, and that by-election was caused by the resignation of John Profumo. And in 1966, as the Teenage Party, he stood against the then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. That was a general election, and anyone listening that night would have heard the returning officer say, Harold Wilson, 41,122 votes. David Sutch, 585 votes. Well, that's another 584 people who thought the National Teenage Party would be a really good idea. But he's best remembered on the political side for his official monster raving loony party. And their first election attempt was in 1983. The transmitter that they used at Shivering Sands was not a particularly sophisticated one, and it was powered by batteries, not a generator. So they had to go off air every few hours to recharge the batteries. And they also chose some really interesting content. They weren't just concerned with the music, was Lord Sutch. Now, in 1960, D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, was the subject of an obscenity lawsuit in the UK. The publisher won that, and that actually marked the end of literary censorship in Britain. On one of the shows, they'd read out the rude bits from Lady Chatterley and other bawdy novels. Well, by the September, Lord Sutch had become a little bored with the whole concept of pirate radio. He'd also been offered a tour with his band of Australia and New Zealand. Plus, there was a general election looming in 1964, and he wanted to focus on his political activities. That's actually the general election that Harold Wilson for Labour Party won by a 4-seat majority. They were interesting times. Well, he sold his share in the radio station to Reg Calvert for £5,000, and Calvert rebranded the station as Radio City. For our next piece of music, we'll hear the song that opened Radio Sutch, and this is Screaming Lord Sutch with Jack the Ripper. Radio London was one of the most successful of the pirate stations. It was started in mid-64 by Don Pearson. He was a guard dealer from Texas, and he bought a former US minesweeper, and after a refit in Miami, it became Radio London ship Galaxy. Now, it was in the November that they dropped anchor off Frinton-on-Sea. But Don Pearson quit quite early on in the game after disagreements with other investors. He actually quit before the first broadcast, but he did go on and set up Radio England and Britain Radio. Well, 6 a.m. on the 23rd December 1964 was the first official show from Radio London. Pete Brady presented it, and the first song was Cliff Richard with I Could Easily Fall in Love with You. Obviously, Cliff was very cool in the mid-1960s. The DJ team was led by the experienced DJ Tony Windsor. And when he joined Radio London, he changed his name from Tony Withers, and he'd previously been a broadcaster in his home country of Australia and also on Radio Atlanta, which became Radio Caroline South. Now, most of the other DJs were experienced, and several changed their names when they joined Radio London. The only novice DJ was Kenny Everett, believe it or not. This is where he started, and he became their biggest star. You probably also heard of Dave Cash. Well, he joined Radio London shortly after the launch. And the Big L's, as Radio London was affectionately known, the Big L's Fab 40, brought the American Top 40 playlist approach to the UK. And their particular Top 40 wasn't necessarily the same as the national UK chart. Some of the songs on the Big L's Fab 40 weren't even in the current charts. Programmes started at 6 a.m. and ended at 9 p.m, and they soon gained a very large audience. They were the first offshore station to give news bulletins, which were apparently nicked off the BBC, and they announced them as On the Half Hour, Radio London News tells you more, says it better. They also had sponsored religious shows, which was quite a popular feature with pirate radio ships, and they were apparently profitable within a couple of years. Well, on the 20th of April 1965, American airman First Lieutenant John C. Wynne was injured when he ejected out of his fighter aircraft at high speed. But lucky for him, the tender, which regularly serviced Radio London and Radio Caroline South ships, happened to be in the area. The tenders brought provisions and transported personnel to and from ships. Well, the tender rescued Lieutenant Wynne and took him to Radio London. From there, he went back to shore and on to hospital. Now, Radio Caroline South's been mentioned a couple of times. And who was Radio Caroline South, I can hear you say? Well, that story's coming up after the song that opened Radio London. Cliff Richard, I Could Easily Fall in Love with You. Radio City rebranded from Radio Such after Screaming Lord Such sold out to his co-owner and manager, Reg Calvert. And on the 30th of September 1964, Radio City made its first broadcast. Now, they claimed to have the first female pirate radio DJs, and they included Peggy Knight and Candy, Reg Calvert's daughter. Now, she hosted Candy's Pop Shop show in the school holidays. The income wasn't too high for Radio City compared to other stations, and they augmented it by taking on American religious programmes. Now, in the summer of 1964, Radio Caroline and Radio Atlanta merged. And Atlanta was another ship-bound pirate station, and they were in the Mi Amigo. And the Atlanta was actually situated in the same area as Radio London. Radio Atlanta weren't getting anything like the audience they anticipated because they were losing out big time to Radio London. So after the merger, Radio Caroline became Radio Caroline North, and they broadcast from Ramsey Bay, Isle of Man way, and the main guy there was Ronan O'Reilly. And Radio Atlanta became Radio Caroline South, we were talking about earlier. And the Mi Amigo broadcasted from Frinton-on-Sea. Now, the two guys there of note were Alan Crawford and Major Oliver Smedley. Now, we'll be returning big time to Smedley very shortly. And in fact, Radio Atlanta, Caroline South, was anchored within sight of Radio London. They could actually see each other. Worth mentioning Manx Radio on the Isle of Man. Now, the Isle of Man, of course, is part of the British Isles, and they made their first broadcast on the 29th of June 64, but they weren't a pirate station. They had a GPO licence, I mean, they were part of the British Isles, but they had separate laws to the UK. And what this meant was that the Isle of Man had commercial radio a decade before mainland Britain. And mention them as well because they had a very close relationship with Radio Caroline. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing for the pirate ships. On the 12th of January 66, Radio London went adrift in the early hours of the morning after dragging her anchor and actually drifted into territorial waters, so they had to stop broadcasting. Anyway, they fixed the problem. By early afternoon, they were back in their old spot and back on the air. Just a week later, Radio Caroline South had a much more dramatic experience. They lost their anchor in bad weather and drifted into territorial waters. Now, they had to send out a mayday, and they ran aground around midnight. The crew and DJs were taken ashore to the local police station. Technically, they were shipwrecked, and under British maritime law, they were entitled to some warm clothing. And apparently the police sergeant knocked up a local outfitters and they were given new clothes suitable for mariners. But all was well, it was all a happy ending. And the DJs on board Radio Caroline South at this point were Dave Lee Travis and Tony Blackburn. In the summer of 1965, Radio Caroline South, Oliver Smedley, began discussions to take over Radio City. Both stations were losing listeners to Radio London. Now, Radio City operated on the old fort at Shivering Sands, and the proposal was that the fort became the base for Radio Caroline South because it was cheaper to operate from a fort rather than a ship, and their ship, the Mi Amigo, would then move off to somewhere with less competition than the very, very successful Radio London. Now, Radio Caroline South, Oliver Smedley, provided a much more powerful transmitter to Radio City on Shivering Sands Fort as part of this deal. As negotiations were getting underway, Radio City took over Knockjohn Fort just over Southend. Well, Reg Calvert had an eye to the future and he was looking for a home for his next radio station. And this is where Radio Essex comes into the picture. Southend businessman Roy Bates, he planned to start his own pirate radio station, Radio Essex, on that same fort, Knockjohn Fort. Now, Knockjohn Fort repeatedly changed hands and actually all became quite nasty. Happily, they reached an agreement. Radio City got their equipment back, that was the transmitter from Caroline South, and Roy Bates got the fort, and in the October of 65, Radio Essex was on the air as another pirate station. Sadly, Reg Calvert's talks with Caroline South collapsed. Ronan O'Reilly, the owner of Caroline North, if you remember, he'd merged with Radio Atlanta, which became Caroline South. Well, he bought out Alan Crawford's share of Caroline South, and now he controlled both Caroline North and Caroline South. And when these talks collapsed around the April of 66, he immediately opened up talks with Radio London for a joint venture with them, and they were actually Caroline South's main competitor. Well, time for a little more music, and from the week commencing the 10th of April 1966, number one on the Big L's Fab 40 was the Spencer Davis Group, and Somebody Help Me. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravel Show and the story of pirate radio in the mid-1960s. Now, lots of bands and artists mentioned in the show have gigs in the diary. Now, to check out this latest tour information, just see my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. And at the top, you'll see 1960s, 70s artists touring now. Click on that, and it gives you the dates and venues for all the gigs that they have in the diary. Well, back to the story. Now, Reg Calvert and Radio London agreed to form a new radio station. And in the May of 66, a deal was done and a draft document was drawn up. And they were going to set up a company called Sweet Music, owned jointly by Reg Calvert and Radio London, and operate a new station, UK GM. And that was United Kingdom Good Music. Sadly, before this could happen, there was a raid on Radio City's Shivering Sands Fort, Now, Oliver Smedley was no longer involved with Radio Caroline South, but he still wanted to be in offshore radio, and he still considered that he had the asset of the transmitter that he delivered to Reg Calvert on the Shivering Sands as part of the now defunct Caroline South Radio City deal. And as talks between Calvert and Radio London were progressing, Smedley was becoming increasingly concerned that he'd lose this asset. And on the night of the 19th, 20th of June, the fort was boarded by Smedley, Kitty Black, who was another investor in the old Radio Atlanta, and some out-of-work riggers. The seaman strike was on at the time. Well, having ensured that the station would no longer transmit, Oliver Smedley and Kitty Black left the fort, and Smedley arranged a meeting with Philip Birch, the MD of Radio London. He said that the transmitter was his, he had possession of the fort, and he wanted a share of the deal. Well, Birch was having none of this, and he just walked out. Now, Smedley then told Reg Calvert he could have his station back for £5,000, plus a share of the advertising revenue. Now, £5,000 was a lot of money in the mid-1960s. To put it into context, you could probably buy 8 pints of beer or more for £1. Well, as you can imagine, Calvert refused, and he told Smedley that the boarding party needed to leave immediately. Otherwise, Calvert would take it back by force if necessary. The police had told him that they couldn't remove the boarders because it was out of their jurisdiction. And they actually suggested that he talk to Oliver Smedley, which he did, with tragic consequences. Reg Calvert visited Smedley at his home in Essex that evening. There was a scuffle. Smedley shot Calvert with a shotgun, and Calvert died. Smedley was charged with murder. It was reduced to manslaughter, but he was acquitted at trial. As you can imagine, Radio London pulled out of the UK GM deal, and the boarders left a week or so later, and Radio City resumed transmission. Well, for our next piece of music, let's have the song that started it all for pirate radio. The first song played by Radio Caroline back on the 28th of March 1964. Possibly a tip of the cap to Radio Luxembourg signal, would famously faded in and out, and this is the Rolling Stones. Not Fade Away. Back to Radio London. Well, Kenny Everett was fired at the back end of 1965 because he was consistently making fun of the evangelical programmes. Now, these shows were sponsored and the station was not very keen to lose the revenue, but he did return in mid-1966 because he promised to behave himself. Well, in the August of 66, the Beatles embarked on their last ever tour. It was a world tour, and they invited some journalists and DJs to accompany them, and Kenny Everett of Radio London was one of those DJs. Now, he'd ring his story back on a short telephone. They'd edit the call, add some music, and hey presto, they got a radio show. Now, he couldn't call the ship directly with his stories because the GPO, the post office, had cut off ship-to-shore communications for all the pirate radio ships. By the summer of 1966, the pirate stations were doing really well. In an NOP poll in the July of 66, it was seen that Radio London had over 8 million listeners. Radio Caroline, this is both ships, North and South, had combined figures of just under 9 million, and Radio 390, Radio England and Radio Scotland all had over 2 million listeners. And the BBC and British government still weren't listening, as it were. And it was the 1st of April 67 that Radio London decided to play an April Fool joke on their listeners. And that was the Radio East Anglia joke. What they did, they pretended that Radio London was being drowned out by the new Radio East Anglia test transmissions on an adjoining frequency, but with a more powerful transmission. Now, the newspapers had been reporting that the BBC would have local radio and commercial radio was on the horizon, all after the pirates had disappeared. So it was a very believable April Fool's joke. And in the early part of 1967, John Peel, the legendary John Peel, joined Radio London. Now, he'd been working in America on the radio networks over there, and he initially covered for DJs and also had a midnight to 2 a.m. graveyard slot. Now, there were no executives listening at that time of night, so instead of sticking to the Fab 40 playlist, he launched the Perfume Garden. Now, in this, he was playing the likes of Captain Beefheart, Jefferson Airplane, Mark Bolan's Tyrannosaurus Rex. And he managed to become established before anybody realised just what he was doing. Well, on the 3rd of February, Radio London had a serious exclusive. They played Strawberry Fields Forever for the first time, anywhere. Shortly after that, in the March, Kenny Everett departed Radio London and he went off to work for the BBC. I mean, we really are coming to the end game now. But before it did go, Radio London had a very good premiere, once again with the Beatles. They premiered Sgt. Pepper, and the DJ who presented that particular show was Ed Stewpot Stewart. Now, the story goes that at an EMI production meeting, a member of staff had a cassette recorder in a bag, hidden away, and recorded the entire album. A fan of the station brought the tape to Radio London, and the programme director, Alan Keane, then contacted Dick James, the Beatles music publisher, and said that they would play the poor quality tape if they weren't given an advance copy of the album. Well, this is blackmail. Absolutely. It worked. They received a copy of the album and had their world exclusive premiere of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Well, doubt's been cast on whether the tape ever existed, but Radio London, they got that exclusive. The album was released in the UK on the 1st of June, 2 weeks later. And now we really are at the end. On the 14th of August 1967, Radio London ceased broadcasting at 3 p.m. The last show was hosted by Ed Stewart and Paul Kay. Their last song was The Beatles' Day in the Life off Sgt. Pepper, and that was banned by the BBC at the time because of the drug references. The last voice was Paul Kay. He'd also been the first voice on the radio, and the new act came into force a few hours later. Well, their neighbour, Radio Caroline South, continued on. If you remember, they were actually in sight of each other. They welcomed new listeners from Radio London and even held a minute's silence for the now defunct Radio London. Now, DJs from Radio London who joined the original Radio 1 team included Ed Stewart, Kenny Everett, Tony Blackburn, John Peel, Dave Cash and a bunch of others. And then historically, on the 30th of September 1967, the BBC launched their Radio 1. Tony Blackburn was the first DJ on, and he introduced the Moves' Flowers in the Rain. And that heralded Britain's first legal radio station dedicated to pop and rock music. Well, that's it. Well, it certainly was for Pirate Radio. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show on the story of pirate radio in the 1960s. Hope you've enjoyed it half as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled. Remember, you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Simply go to the website rockandrollunravelled.com. Click on the competition and I'll post the signed copy of the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look at Rock and Roll Unravelled. Now, to play us out, the song that signalled it was all over for the pirates. This is the first song played on Radio 1, and it's The Move, Flowers in the Rain.